Good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to the Courtauld Institute of Art and to our Research Forum program, and particularly to this event, which is under the rubric of Dr. Bahari's, or under the patronage of Dr. Bahari, the late Dr. Bahari, who gave us a fund for which we have managed to bring in specialists on the arts of Iran for the past 4 years. This is the fourth of the series. I want to, in his absence and the absence of a sort of a very kind person who made this possible, to remember them actually, and to bring this up for us to know that if it weren't for such philanthropic support, we couldn't do anything, really, truth be told, and hint, hint at the same time. So I am absolutely delighted and most honored to welcome Dr. Leila Diba, a friend and colleague from many years ago. We both are graduates of the Institute of Fine Arts of New York University, with her focus being on the arts of the Qajar period in Iran, although her dissertation, which is not published, Leila, I should say, on the lacquer work of the 15th through 18th centuries, or 17th centuries, a very important subject for which you have to come to my office and borrow my copy of her dissertation if you ever want to do work on this project. Leila Diba has really left us with a very important seminal series of works. The most prominent in my mind, because I was witness to what it did, in fact, in New York and beyond, is that exhibition of Royal Persian paintings of the Qajar epoch, which was first of all, produced a seminal catalogue, which is pretty hefty. I wanted to bring it over, and I thought maybe that's a bit too much and I would put pressure on you. But it is truly the work with which we start when we look at this 18th, 19th centuries in particular, this long 19th century arts of the Qajar Iran. The exhibition, which was preceded by her really important intervention as the curator at the Brooklyn Museum, for the museum to collect some of the available works at the time and to create actually a viable collection of Qajar arts in America, the only one of its kind there, is extraordinary actually. And I remember when the exhibition opened, the wonderful art critic of the New York Times, please, Holland Cotter, wrote, "Where was Qajar art all my life?" And it was like an eye-opening event that this material was completely unknown, at least in the American side of the Atlantic. So the other work, I mean, she has done a lot of work, and a lot of it is in a variety of publications, which I will leave out for now in order to bring her to the podium. The other one I wanted to mention was her exhibition, co-curated exhibition, Iran Modern, which was held at Asia Society Museum in New York in 2013-14. Again, another groundbreaking event, as it really looked at the sort of a longue durée of modernity in Iranian arts, all the way to the contemporary moment. I also wanted to add two important, in addition to all the work she does, advising various museums, having a a very stellar career as a curator, especially at the Brooklyn Museum, the teaching she has done. I wanted to highlight two important pieces of her sort of work and contributions. One of which is that she's on the board of the Sudovan Memorial Fund, which is a very important, and most of them are here actually, members of this board, which is delightful, a very important sort of foundation, if I may put it, which has been instrumental in supporting research, exhibitions, publications on the arts and culture of Iran from the antiquities to the present. I personally have been a beneficiary of this generous support in multiple ways. We at the Courtauld have been recipients of the generosity of the Sudovan Memorial Fund. This is not why I invited Leila, by the way. Let me just say that in advance. And I'll tell you why I invited Leila in a moment. And that students, now several in generations, have been supported by the generosity of the Sudovan Memorial Fund. Foundation, I'm sorry. And that many of these early sort of pushes forward have resulted in, for instance, PhDs that move on to get grants at major institutions and move on to hold on jobs and publish major works along the way. So, the other role she's playing is a very recent appointment to the Board of Trustees of the National Museum of Asian Art, which includes, and better known to us as, Freer and Sattler galleries, which will entail a very important inclusion of someone with this sort of a broad and deep at once knowledge about the arts of Iran, especially from the 18th century onwards, something which really has a tremendous impact on the future collecting at that major museum. So, the reason Leila Diba is here is because she is, and was, the first director, in fact, the only director of the famous Negarestan Museum, and its chief curator. And she is working on this project, gathering research material, and the very difficult task of putting together images, just simply images that present to us what was this museum in Tehran, which was established as the repository for the arts of 18th and 19th century Iran, was started in 1975 and basically at the time of the revolution went into close down, and I'm not going further because Leila is going to talk to you about it, to us about it. That is a very important specialized knowledge that I don't know of anyone else who can present us with this. That's why Leila Diba is here. And for that, I'm grateful to you. And to everyone to be here in this rainy, rather nasty-looking evening outside of this warm and comfortable room. I hope you're all warm and comfortable. I'm delighted that we can all do the greetings for the sake of everyone's health and happiness. I recommend when you meet her afterwards to carry on with that, or whatever, fist bump or whatever might be the case, because she is the target of everyone's attention after she gives her talk. So on that note, I want to invite everyone to join me in welcoming Leila Diba, please.
Thank you so much, Susan, for that wonderful introduction, which I don't deserve, but I am delighted and honored to be here this evening speaking to you and to all our friends in London about a topic that is very dear to my heart. This is the first public lecture I'm giving on a personal and historic chapter of my life. And I want to thank my son Ahmad Reza for encouraging me to give a more personal sort of approach to lectures in which I'm usually not present personally. So, Art in Peril, the case of the Negarestan Museum and its collection of 18th and 19th century Iranian art. I will begin also by telling you, you will see many unpublished works, and if anyone wants further information on them, please contact me on academia.edu or Facebook. So, the first step in liquidating a people is to erase its memory, destroy its books, its culture, its history. Then you have somebody write new books, manufacture a new culture, invent a new history. Before long, the nation will begin to forget what it was, what it is. These powerful and prophetic words of the Czech writer Milan Kundera, written in 1979, are equally pertinent today. In recent years, civil wars, terrorisms, and revolutions have destabilized the Middle East and Western Asia and taken a terrible human and cultural toll. Cultural destruction knows no boundaries, geographical or historical. Cultural cleansing in the name of religion or politics aimed at institutions which are symbols of national memory and pride, such as libraries and museums, is as old as civilization. Examples range from the burning of the Library of Alexandria by the Romans in 48 BC to the total destruction of the libraries and museums in Bosnia in 1992. Probably the most egregious act committed in the name of religion was the 2001 destruction of the monumental statues of the Buddhas of Bamiyan in Afghanistan, perhaps recently matched by the annihilation of Aleppo, Mosul, and Palmyra. No amount of modern technology can reconstruct oh dear, I'm missing a page. Oh, here it is. Or reconstruction can truly bring back the reality of these cities or visualize the memory that they embody. Today's lecture will focus on the case of the Negarestan Museum of 18th and 19th century Iranian art in Tehran, which flourished from 1975 to 1979 in order to draw attention to the fate of its world-class, unique collection, the core of which had been repatriated from the United Kingdom to Iran by Shahbanou Farah in 1969. This case is another tragic and little-known example of the impact of revolution and political ideology on institutions built to outlast the vagaries of time and history. Scholarly interest in the history of Pahlavi-era museums has focused on the Museum of Contemporary Art, and the discourse on modernity and nationalism has largely framed the debate. I would like to shift the focus to the question of cultural destruction and concomitant cultural activism as the most productive approach to charting the history of the Negarestan. This lecture will tell the story of the deliberate erasure of the museum, not its physical destruction, as was the case with the sites I've just discussed. As the museum's chief curator and founding director at the tender age of 27, and I was a woman, I was an eyewitness to the creation of the museum. I will advocate for works that cannot speak for themselves and ask this audience to participate in the recovery of an important chapter of our shared heritage and the preservation of an endangered legacy for our children. Tonight, we will re-examine for the first time in 40 years the context of its creation, reconstruct its brief history, and explore the museum's life in the city, its collections and publications, and curious afterlife. This leads me to say a few words about the process and production of this lecture, a subject usually relegated to a footnote and rarely discussed in public. This lecture is not the usual art historical enterprise, but rather the product of the sharing of critically important archives of oral interviews with participants and witnesses to the events, of international collaborations, and unprecedented avenues of research. These resources offer us the means of undoing the destruction of the memory of the museum. By way of example, in order to reconstruct the appearance of the building and its collections, of which I had only a certain vague memories, especially of the building itself, and of which only the oil paintings were sufficiently published, I had recourse to video films taken of the museum in the 1970s, which had somehow been saved and from which we were able to capture still images. One of these, which was made by National Iranian Television and Radio, from the Tamasha section, was being shown before the lecture, so we could share this. So now we proceed to the Negarestan, a story of modernity, change, and erasure. The museum was inaugurated on April 23, 1975, under the aegis of Shahbanou Farah Pahlavi. The museum was housed in a small palace of the reign of Reza Shah, within the Marble Palace complex in downtown Tehran. On the screen, you see a recent plan of the area by the original architect, Hassan Lorzadeh. On February 27, 1979, the building was occupied by Iranian Revolutionary Guards. The collections, which had been inventoried, sealed, and secured in an underground storage for safety by the museum staff, were officially handed over, and the museum closed its doors forever. The co-opting of the building was part of a larger pattern of Islamification of Tehran, which included renaming of streets and the occupation of numerous government buildings by competing power groups of the new regime. In the course of its short lifespan, the Negarestan became the preeminent showcase for the finest collections of 18th and 19th century Iranian art in the Western Hemisphere. The collections, according to my calculations, grew from a few hundred works to over 3,000, and the museum evolved from an art gallery for official visitors to a fully functioning modern cultural institution designed to engage with a large and varied public. Let us look at museums balancing heritage and modernity in Pahlavi, Iran, and the Islamic Republic. The Negarestan was established as part of a wider museum building program initiated in the 1970s by the Shahbanou, a program aimed at balancing heritage and modernity, which was later co-opted by the Islamic Republic. During the Pahlavi era, museum policy was intended to preserve the country's rich cultural heritage, its tradition of monarchy, and to showcase Iran's emergence as a modern cultural power, an example of what we would call today soft power. Museums were already synonymous with modernity during the Qajar era, when the first museum, housed in the Golestan Palace, was established by Nasruddin Shah Qajar between the years 1876 and 1879. The modern Iranian museum system dates back to the 1930s. It reflected French museological traditions and was managed by a Ministry of Arts and Culture. The museums included the Iran Bastan, or Archaeological Museum, the Museum of Decorative Arts, and the Ethnographic Museum. The Golestan Palace Museum and Library was part of the court system, while the crown jewels, now the National Jewelry Museum, were considered a national treasure and were housed in the central bank in Tehran. In 1976, that is 1 year after the opening of the Negarestan, the Marble Palace, which was the location of Reza Shah Pahlavi's private office, was declared a museum and opened its doors in 1977, a year before the revolution, according to recent reports. According to the same report, some collections from the Golestan Museum were transferred there. At that time, private collections, such as the Malik Library and the Mohaddam collection, also housed Iranian art. The new Shahbanou Farah museums, in my opinion, not only complemented and enriched the older institutions, but also provided much-needed additional spaces to showcase rarely seen collections. They were intended to supplement, not replace, the older museum system. The Negarestan itself can be described as a precursor to what is known today as heritage museums, institutions created to preserve indigenous cultural artifacts which emerged after cultural heritage legislation enacted in the 1950s. The execution of the Negarestan project may be viewed in the context of the debate on Westoxication or Occidentosis in both intellectual and government circles. Both government and opposition forces ultimately reached a consensus on the importance of validating and preserving authentic, quote-unquote, Iranian art and culture, in which the Queen's recovery of Qajar art and its lavish display in a museum setting would play a significant role. Contrary to the more controversial Shiraz Arts Festival, the Negarestan does not appear to have been the subject of specific criticism by the intelligentsia. This project entailed a certain risk for the Queen. On the one hand, her cultural advocacy was seen to unduly increase her influence, and on the other, could be perceived as support for a previous dynasty which still had its supporters. The museum was a blend of a state-sponsored gallery and a modern, multifunctional art museum with temporary exhibition spaces and programming. This blending of tradition and modernity can be seen in the choice of a Czech design firm to renovate an early Pahlavi building, and in the impact of foreign advisors in the museum's planning, such as ICOM, balanced, however, by a local Iranian museum staff. The museum represented a transitional model for museum building in Iran, as cultural policy and museum planning under the Shahbanou's aegis was in its infancy. This was the first museum to be opened. Because it was the first museum, expectations were high, and its mission was ambitious both locally and globally. Even before the opening, a selection of the Qajar coffee house and modern paintings acquired at the time was sent on an extended international tour which included the Salon d'Automne in Paris. Other museums either planned or opened by the Shahbanou's office included the previously mentioned Museum of Contemporary Art, the Carpet Museum, the Abgine Museum of Ceramics and Glass in Tehran, and regional museums and cultural centers in Kerman, Shiraz, and Lorestan. The museums operated independently until 1977, when an umbrella organization, the Shahbanou Farah Foundation, was established. All the museums, except Tomoka, can also be described as heritage museum forerunners. Tomoka from the outset was very cosmopolitan because of the scope and the publicity of its acquisitions of international modern art, its transnational staff, and the wide press coverage of the museum building and its opening. The Negarestan is the only one to have completely disappeared. The question is why? Was it only a land grab by powerful new forces seeking to assert their presence? Or was it also justified by the very nature of the collection, consisting predominantly of paintings of idealized court beauties and powerful monarchs, so visually compelling they could literally induce passion and love, which were anathema to the values of the Islamic regime? Over the course of the 40 years of the Islamic Republic, the fate of the other museums varied, though none were as traumatic as that of the Negarestan. Initially, many were closed because of their close association with the Pahlavi monarchy, or because their collections were not ideologically acceptable to the new regime. The Islamic regime privileged calligraphy and other forms of art which were deemed, quote-unquote, Islamic, and which reflected the anachronistic tendency to iconoclasm and aniconism in contemporary Islamic religious movements, be they Shiite or Sunni. The only exception to this tendency were the giant mural paintings of religious figures and martyrs of the Iran-Iraq War, which dominated the Tehran cityscape for years, perhaps because of the indigenous history of wall painting and religion. Some museums were looted, such as the Reza Museum and Cultural Center in Yavaran. But very soon, the regime opened the Pahlavi family palaces to the public in Yavaran and Saadabad, which unfortunately did not occur with the Negarestan, and then it slowly began inventing its own museum system. The Martyrs Museum was a case in point where the traditional function of a museum to preserve, display, and educate evolved to the museum as a center for ritual activities, in tune with the culture of mourning and martyrdom that prevailed in the early years of the revolution. Tomoka is the best known and documented of the Shahbanou Farah group of museums, which survived the initial purges. After a brief closure, it reopened its doors and functioned as the principal cultural showcase for the new regime. In the 1990s, with the advent of the Khatami administration, the museum began to operate less as a semi-official arm of the government, and according to some scholars, became a center for youth-based cultural events and gatherings. The collections were published, and exhibition abroads were planned, which never materialized, as you know. Perhaps the most notable event involving the institution was the exchange of a painting of a nude woman by the abstract expressionist artist Willem de Kooning for the text block and remaining illustrations of the celebrated 16th century Royal Shah Tahmasp manuscript, which thus became the property of Tomoka instead of being returned to the Golestan Palace Library, its original home. Luckily, this type of deaccessioning based on the political ideology sanctioned by the regime was not duplicated. The tendency of the government towards erasing a Western art collection, seen already in the case of the Negarestan, which had become extremely valuable but was ideologically suspect, again points to the tension between modernity and tradition still prevalent in Iran today. Another Pahlavi-era museum, the Shayad Monument, survived, but was co-opted and converted to reflect, again, the new ideologies. With time, the Iran Bastan, or Archaeological Museum, was renamed the National Museum of Iran, and the Islamic collection, which had not received much attention during the previous regime, was showcased in newly renovated galleries and in its own very substantial building, thus emphasizing the Islamic culture of the new regime. Museums began to play an important role in the tourist industry of the local economy. A recent estimation of museum attendance was 20 million visitors per year, of which 2 million were tourists. It should be noted that the rise of Iranian museums was undoubtedly linked to the expansive museum building programs in the Persian Gulf and the growth of tourism and heritage industries there, in Abu Dhabi and Qatar particularly. Now, the Saadabad Museum Complex in North Tehran became a major destination in the 1990s, and more recently, the Musée of Guinée, just down the street from the original location of the 1975 Negarestan, was opened using the plans and casework designed by the Austrian architect Hans Pollein and collections acquired in the 1970s. In 2017, with great fanfare, a newly reinvented Negarestan Palace and Garden Museum, and here I state specifically it's the Negarestan Palace and Garden Museum, the site of the former art school of Kamulimog, opened with galleries dedicated to Qajar painting and to the work of Monir Sharudi Farman donated from her private collection. This 2017 iteration was indeed a strange example of cultural survival and perhaps deliberate appropriation of the identity of the 1975 institution. The misuse of historical artifacts, or on a lesser level, the carelessness with which cultural heritage is treated by the authorities, is seen in the fact that the monumental mural paintings of Fatih Shah and his court, which you see on the screen, and here are details thereof, that were installed in the new Negarestan, were, according to the scholar Kianush Motaqedi, actually taken from a Qajar palace in the holy city of Qom. truly a case of historical amnesia masquerading as cultural patronage. Most surprisingly, the Marble Palace has been reopened as a museum. Its renovation features the original splendid decor of mirrorwork, painted murals, and lacquer decoration, supplemented by a display of artworks gathered from different locations spanning many centuries of Iranian history. The famous office of Reza Pahlavi, which was decorated in most wonderful Khatam Kari, I have not seen images of, so I don't know if that has been part of the restoration. It should be noted that the museum was transferred from the Ministry of Culture, Heritage and Tourism, or ICHTO, to the Bunyad Mustazafan, the Foundation of the Oppressed and Disabled, whose original mission as guardian of confiscated cultural property now appears to have been expanded to include museum administration and renovation. Thus we see the Islamic regime co-opted Pahlavi-era museum system, adapted it to its own ideology, using previous designs and collections which had been acquired or repatriated, as is the case of the Negarestan, and as had been hoped for but did not happen with the Shahnameh. While one must be grateful that part of Iran's cultural heritage has now re-emerged, we should also be aware that the meaning has been changed, and the provenance and patronage of these historic collections erased by a process of confiscation, secrecy, redistribution, and dispersal, in the process of which their meaning has often been distorted or erased. The principal victim of this process was arguably the Negarestan. The previous regime may be legitimately critiqued for privileging ancient Iran in the National Museum. However, what are we to make of the current regime's concerted effort to simply erase the last 200 years of Iran's culture as displayed in the Negarestan? The following account of its history from 1975 to 1979, 4 short years, and its strange half-life from 1979 onwards, is the only record of a cultural tragedy of historic proportions which concerns each and every one of us today. This is merely a beginning and will require extended efforts from a coalition of Iranians and international organizations to raise awareness and demand the restitution of these historic collections in their entirety to the Iranian people. So, history 1975 to 79. Naming the museum. The Negarestan derived its name from a palace in Tehran built circa 1812 during the reign of Fatih Shah Qajar, which later became the site of the Fine Arts Academy founded by Kamal al-Mulk, and which operated until the mid-century. The original structure, the namesake of the Negarestan Museum, was decorated with large-scale mural paintings of the ruler and its court. The term Negarestan also has a more general meaning as a gallery of paintings, a possible reason for the later conflation of the 1975 and 2017 eponymous museums. Inauguration. The museum, as I mentioned, was inaugurated on April 23, 1975, 24 Farvardin 1354, by Shahbanou Farah and Reza Shah Pahlavi and their guests. The opening, as well as subsequent temporary exhibitions and art education programming, were extensively covered in the Iranian press. Scholarly publications, printed materials, posters, and postcards were prepared for the opening, many of which have survived in my archives. There is no catalog of the complete collection, but my research for this lecture currently accounts for only circa 340, 350 works of the original 3,000, what I've been able to gather so far, 10%. Planning, construction, and interior design. The museum was situated in downtown Tehran. You see its image on the screen, captured from a film from Manoto, and it was situated in a park of fine pine trees adjoining the Marble Palace. on the corner of present-day South Philistine and Imam Khomeini Street, then Koch and Sepah. The building itself was constructed at the time of Reza Shah Pahlavi in a high modernist style and may be attributed to one of the leading architects of the post-war era. According to the architectural historian Talin Grigor, the synthesis of Bauhaus and Beaux-Arts element found here presents similarities with the work of Mohsen Fouroui in particular. The two-story elegant residence, which you see on the screen, foregrounded by a pool surrounded by classical style statuary. Can you see the statuary? Yes? It's in the front. It was so unusual. Let me see if I can get this out. Wait. Yeah, this did work earlier. Is it working?
You can use the pointer as well.
Where is the pointer?
I mean, on
I think this.
here, this one.
This.
You can
There
also
it is.
do
It
this.
took a little while, but there it is. It's white. Where is? Oh, is that
Oh,
yours?
it's this one. Yeah. Here it is.
Okay, there's the statuary, and there's another.
And there's another here.
One on the left. Thank you,
Okay.
Susanna. Anyway, so this is the view of the facade, foregrounded by the pool, and it was entered through a short flight of stairs and column portico, and was faced in white stone. A notable feature was a series of floor-to-roof triple windows of the southern facade. Although the building followed the style of modernist urban residential architecture of the era, it lacked, except for some minor architectural details, the Sasanian and Achaemenid revival elements of the official government structures of the period. Formerly used as the palace of the Queen Mother Taj al-Muluk, the building served as the residence of the Shahbanou during her engagement in 1959, probably because of its proximity to the marble palace where the wedding took place. During the renovation of the structure in 1974 to 75, the interior was converted by the consulting design firm Art Centrum of Czechoslovakia into a modern museum in collaboration with Her Imperial Majesty's private secretariat. According to newspaper accounts, the renovation budget was 96 million reals. The building was climate controlled, and a security system, bookstore, storage area, and library, snack bar, and education spaces were added to the original structure. No other museum provided these services, and a contemporary account by Leslie Blanche describes her admiration at the reading materials available in the library. An underground extension for cultural activities and a loading dock for large artworks was planned, as you see on the screen, but not completed until after 1978. In another act of cultural appropriation by the current regime, the adjacent underground site was converted into a Quran museum in 1998. The newly renovated painting galleries were situated on the first floor. For those of you who remember, 63 Qajar paintings, which I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, were displayed in purpose-built alcoves, lined in silk, separated by opaque gilt glass panels. The images that are out of focus that you'll see in the lecture are really here as documents. We were able to extract them from the video films, but it's more important for you to get a sense of what this looked like rather than be sticklers that they have to be in focus. So they're out of focus. And hopefully maybe someone can make them clearer. The design was intended to evoke the richness of the original Palatine context of the paintings. It represented the taste of the era, very different from the spare modern aesthetic and neutral color tones preferred today. A short multimedia presentation on Qajar art was shown in one of the galleries, and a glass sculpture presenting a gilded emblem of the Shahbanou's crown was displayed inside the museum entrance. A selection of arms and arbor was also displayed in one of the galleries. The second floor featured a long gallery with cases housing decorative arts, such as Bohemian glass for the Persian market, alternating with hanging silk carpets. a treasury with 49 enamel works and precious inlaid objects behind the same type of opaque glass cases, and a monumental painting in 3 rows of the sons of Fatali Shah. A gallery devoted to the display of manuscripts and lacquer work, which you see on the screen, and 2 galleries for temporary exhibitions were also created, as well as administrative offices. The lower level housed modern spaces for museums, services, and storage, as mentioned above. On the screen, you see the plans for each floor, as we would have walked through the museum, recovered from one of the surviving brochures printed for museum visitors, which I have now scanned for all eternity. So here is the first floor, second floor, with the staircase and long gallery in the treasury. And here is the underground area with the various spaces I described. Administration and programming. The museum was originally administered through the private secretariat of the Shahbanou. A nominal entrance fee of 2 riyals was charged, and membership was available as of 1977. Staff, in addition to myself, included curatorial, education, conservation, and administrative personnel and security. Here is the conservator restoring one of the wonderful but very damaged paintings. After 1977, the museum became an independent entity with its own board of directors and was incorporated, as I mentioned, into the Shahbanou Farah Foundation. This foundation was of immense importance in terms of the influence of the Queen and her patronage. And it is unfortunate because it began so late in the Pahlavi reign, little is known about its actual functioning and achievements, but there were many. Art education programming at the Negarestan was truly the first of its kind in Iran, a fusion of Iranian traditions and European and American models. It was spearheaded by Dr. Hadi Hazavai, who appeared out of nowhere on my doorstep, and who, by the way, held a PhD in art education from an American university from 1977 to 1978. Hazavai's accomplishments included establishing a mini-museum for children in the basement and playing an instrumental role in planning the groundbreaking 1978 Religious Inspiration Exhibition and its related programming. Here you see Dr. Hazavai discussing some of the works with Khanum Diba, the mother of the Queen, who actually came to the inauguration. The Negarestan permanent collection was supplemented by the programming of the second floor gallery, such as you just saw. In all, 9 exhibitions, accompanied by bilingual catalogs, were presented from 1975 to 1978, including the first exhibition of Iranian wedding contracts, a record number, I think, for museums at the time. The exhibitions were documented by bilingual catalogs and printed posters, which the publications, which unfortunately were not widely distributed, and contributed to the ease of erasure of the museums. So if you print publications, make sure you send them to the Library of Congress. Whenever possible, these exhibitions were supplemented by concerts, lectures, and films. A particularly popular event was naqali, or storytelling in front of coffeehouse paintings, as you see on the screen, which accompanied the exhibition of religious inspiration in Iranian art. The special exhibitions hold a particularly important place in the history of the museum as they document collections which have now been lost to us and are the subject of great interest to researchers. We received inquiries from scholars in Iran about the collection of graphics from the Shahbanou, and these we produced a little catalog, and these are some of the works that were in it. So 30 years later, these publications still have meaning. And this was the last exhibition that never happened on Turkmen art. Let us now turn to permanent collections, acquisition, provenance, and appreciation. Prior to the museum's opening in 1975, important collections of Qajar painting and decorative arts were held by Russian, Georgian, British, and French museums, where the works were rarely displayed. Whether the paintings were housed in art history or ethnographic museum didn't matter. They were considered as booty and as the degenerative final chapter of Islamic art and displayed as decorative or ethnographic objects. In 1969, the 63 Qajar paintings were acquired by the Shahbanou, I believe for the sum of $1 million or $1.5 million through private sale on the eve of their auction by Sotheby's and returned to their country of origin. Equally important was their display as fine art in a purpose-built museum and was a radically different approach from the European exhibitionary order I just described. On the screen, you see the masterpiece of the collection, the portrait of Fatali Shah by Mir Hadi. The Amory collection was part of a major program of acquisitions for all the Shahbanou Farah museums. This expansive art acquisition program was funded by the national government, it is said, largely from the budget of the NIOC. This acquisition coincided with Iranian collectors' interest in Qajar art, particularly the collections of Senators Mohsen Fouroughi, Mohammad Ali Masoudi, and Kazem Kouros, of Hashem Khosrovani, Izzat Sudovar Malek, and the families of Qajar descendants such as the Rustikar family. Previously, the paintings of the permanent collection formed part of the collection of the British MP Julian Amory, inherited from his uncle and father, both members of the British Foreign Service. Unfortunately, no acquisition records or correspondence has survived. What is clear was that the collection was amassed somewhere in the Middle East before 1941, when they were first published by a certain Y.A. Davoud. Although the Amorys had an educated eye and were in a sense connoisseurs, the paintings were also treated casually, mounted as screens, or their arched shape reformatted to rectangular ones to suit European taste. What was the evaluation abroad and within Iran, and what were the beginnings of the reevaluation? By this act of repatriation after their dispersal and exile, the stage was set for Qajar painting's reevaluation. With one fell swoop, the history of Persian painting would be changed forever. In the modern era, when 16th century Persian art, such as manuscript illustration and carpet production, were universally admired and extensively studied and exhibited, 18th and 19th century art was generally dismissed by art historians and collectors. The appreciation of Qajar art suffered from a general disinterest in the art of the Victorian era, and more specifically from the negative evaluations of Orientalist and colonialist scholars and the modern distaste for hybridity, a defining characteristic of Qajar art. Some scholars have also argued that the period was neglected during the Pahlavi era. While this may be a valid statement for official government policy, activities in the private sphere, such as the interest in Qajar photography and art among Iranian collectors and artists, help to nuance this perception, as does the groundbreaking patronage of Shahbanou Farah in the creation of the Negarestan, as well as historical research in the 1970s by such figures as Feridun Adamiyat, Mansour Ittihadi Nizam Mahfi, and Yahya Zukka in Iran, and Anne Lambton and B.W. Robinson in the United Kingdom. The creation of the Negarestan Museum, whose sole mission was to preserve, study, and display the art of this era, undoubtedly elevated its status and presaged the reevaluation of the field in the 1990s. I would venture that this was a truly transformative achievement of Pahlavi cultural policy. Formation of the paintings, now we get to the heart of the collection, of the lecture. We may distinguish two phases. The first, 69 to 75, that is before the museum opened, and then afterwards, during the years of its operation from 75 until late 78. Soon after the initial acquisitions in 1969, The review of the Amory paintings, led to the decisions that the parameters of the collection needed to be expanded to include additional historical periods as well as other media of the era. For instance, the tradition of monumental dynastic paintings of the ruler and his court, exemplified by the mural paintings of the original Negarestan palace, was not represented in the Amory collection, leading to the acquisition of the large-scale painting of the sons of Pahlavi Shah in 1976, which I will show you shortly. A fine selection of lacquerwork, arts of the book, and decorative arts of the period was acquired, which exemplified the continued tradition of excellence in Iranian craftsmanship and the relationship between the arts. During this first phase, works were acquired in part through direct purchase by the private secretariat and its advisors, architects Mohsen Fouroughi and Yahya Zokak, and in part through the generosity of private collectors. Again, it was a blend, it was a transitional model. The bulk of the collection of enamel work and jewelry was originally purchased at auction by the businessman Ali Rezai and presented to Shahbanou Farah, while a collection of lacquerwork, manuscript, carpets, and watercolors was presented by businessman Ghulam Ali Saif Nasiri. She subsequently donated these objects to the museum. In recognition of their generosity, a gallery bearing his name was provided for Nasiri's objects, and Rezai's donations were displayed with appropriate labeling in the treasury. Now, acquisitions from 75 to 78, the collection continued to grow in the following years. It was a living entity. During this period, the Secretariat was buying large, well-curated collections for the entire new museum system. The Negarestan benefited enormously. The collection grew from a few hundred works in 1975 to approximately 3,000 works by 1978. I was able to, convince them that the Negarestan needed to go back into the 17th century to really be historically representative. So that is how we grew the collection. The bulk of the new acquisitions of 17th to 19th century art was drawn from the Edmond de Rothschild and Mehdi Mahboubian collections, which had been acquired in 76 and 77. Coffee house paintings purchased from Marcus Grigorian and Mounir Farman were not distributed to the Negarestan until 1977, although they may have been acquired during phase one, still unclear. The museum acquired its own budget, finally, in 1977, which included funds for acquisition, and this led to the last work added to the collection, which you'll see shortly, a beautiful portrait of Crown Prince Abbas Mirza. While you will see images of many of these works in the following presentation, such as fine 17th century oil paintings, unfortunately very few records have survived of important additions, such as a great Shahnameh of 1862, copied by Vesal Shirazi and illustrated by Lotfali Suratgar and Dobari, or a Divan Khaban, copied for Pahlavi Shah in 1816. While the former Amory collection itself was well documented, the remainder of the collection, although accessioned in inventories and numbered as many works as possible, we painted the numbers on them in red ink. So if you ever see objects with red ink numbers, according to the system of the Metropolitan Museum, you know these are Negarestan. The remainder of the collection, as I said, although accessioned in inventories, now these inventories are probably still held somewhere by the current regime. It remains unpublished, except for the very few brochures and printouts which are in my archives. These have formed the basis of tonight's lecture, along with the 2 video films and along with 2 calendars which we printed. This detailed discussion of the formation of the collection, although not definitive, is critical to understanding the significant effort which went into the project and the importance of recovering in the future not only the acquisition information and the inventories, but the works themselves. The significance of the investment in art is underlined by the fact that virtually nothing has been acquired for any Iranian museum collection since 1978, apparently due to lack of government funding. Let us recall that the growth of a collection is a vital part of a museum's mission. The following section is the heart of my presentation. It represents a virtual recreation of the vast range and expanse of the collection that we achieved by 1978. They were not just representative, but truly comprehensive. Due to time constraints, this is an overview only, awaiting detailed future studies. The works will be presented for you chronologically as the collection existed in 1979 when it was disappeared. Oil paintings. The selection of life-size oil paintings began with fine Safavid paintings, such as you see on the screen, proceeded with masterpieces by Mirza Baba, produced under Karim Khan's patronage in Shiraz, but the majority of the collection, here's another work, belong to the finest and most clearly defined period of the 19th century, that is the reign of Fatih Shah. Besides the monumental portrait I showed earlier, many fine paintings of women by Abul Qasim, of princes and courtiers by Muhammad Hassan and Abdullah were represented. This is the painting, the last painting that we acquired for the museum in October 1978. That's an important date, if you remember those days. It also featured examples of mid-19th century. On the screen, you see the large monumental painting of the three rows of the sons of Fatih Shah, and then mid-19th century painting, such as this wonderfully dynamic painting by the Shireen painter, and works in the style of Sani al-Mulk and Mirza Agha Bozorg. This is signed from the mid-century. So Sani al-Mulk was only represented by one work, and it was unfinished. And the school of Kamal al-Mulk, such an important moment in Iranian art, was not represented by us. Fortunately, we were able to gather a rich representation of religious paintings and coffeehouse paintings, beginning with the earliest dated coffeehouse painting, 1871, by Mirza Mehdi Naqash, and then continuing with later early 20th century works, and some of them we have yet to identify, so we will be doing future research using archival materials such as newspapers. Leading artists of the period were represented by some of their most iconic works, and all of the major themes of that period were included. By 1978, the collection convincingly illustrated that Qajar art as a whole, originating in the Safavid era and evolving through Afshar and Zand dynasties, actually represented the final flowering of later Persian art and was a bridge to the modern era, thereby supplementing the rarely accessible collection of the Golestan Museum and Library, were masterpieces of later Qajar art, such as the 1001 Night manuscript, illustrated by Sami al-Mulk, and the paintings of Kamal al-Mulk were kept. Next, we come to the lacquer works. In the 1970s, lacquer work was little known abroad, but much appreciated by Iranian collectors. The Negarestan collection was very strong, ranging from works by leading artists known to many of you, from Ali Ashraf to Mirza Sadeh and Mehr Ali, and then later works by Nasrullah Hosseini and Lotfali Suratgar. This comprehensive selection of the field would have been critical to future scholarship of the field had it remained intact. The works on paper also visualized. Now this is an out of focus image, but very important because we captured it from the Tamashan film, and it was a beautiful lacquer. And here's another one, very beautiful, mirror case by Lotfali. The works on paper visualize 2 centuries of artistic evolution, beginning in the late 17th century through the 18th, Zand period, wonderful drawings, early and mid-19th century manuscript, independent page paintings, and entire albums. We had 2 albums, which we duplicated in one of the calendars, with 43 watercolors. I'm only showing you the cover. And please don't forget this image. I'll come back to it later. The exceptional selection of approximately 50 18th and 19th century jewelry and enamel work, beginning with Zand period daggers, included a portrait medallion of Fatali Shah from England, a truly exquisite bejeweled writing set, part of the group acquired from Paris, a wide range of enameled water pipe heads and water pipe components. You can see they're all enameled gold, Basel bands, enameled armbands, and a very long ornament, hair ornament, and a snuff box from the mid-19th century. So we, historically, the collection ranged from the really early 18th all the way through the late 19th century, and included also arms and armor. Needless to say, it was the finest outside of the Iranian crown jewels, and assembled again partly through local acquisition and repatriation. The decorative arts included examples of Iranian ceramics, English ceramics from Worcester, and Bohemian crystal. Now we come to the history post-1979, closing and afterlife. Revolutionary Guards occupied the building in 1979, and the museum evolved into an official government site closed to the public. The building can be seen in this aerial view. Here is an exterior view. That was the only way you can see it nowadays. You can't get close. And here is an aerial view from Google Maps showing the Marble Palace and what I believe circled in the original Negarestan site, and to its right, the Quran Museum. According to newspaper reports, many of the pines of the garden were destroyed in 2015 to make room for a new municipal structure, and the Quran Museum, which was intended to supplant the Negarestan, can also be seen on the image as I mentioned, has apparently been sparsely attended and even has received a decline in government support. After the official handover, the collection all but disappeared. As far as is known, the works were transferred elsewhere. I've heard the name of the Iranian Museum, but have not been sold on the open market. Nonetheless, that watercolor that I asked you to remember of the 2 young European ladies appeared on the art market in London, apparently gifted to the vendor in 2006, but was removed from the sale by the intervention of the speaker. I do not recommend this to any of you in the future, because once you remove it from the sale, it disappears completely. So that is not really a good solution. You draw attention to the illegality of the act, but you lose the work in the process. However, by the 1990s, the collection began to reemerge. As of 1992, a number of the Negarestan paintings were displayed in the Saadabad Museum, and 13 were published in a catalogue of the museum. Here you see a view of one of the galleries. Nowhere, I repeat, nowhere is provenance given, not in the publication, not in the labels. It's like these paintings appeared out of nowhere. The exact number on view is not known, but by 2017-18, another 12 were on display in the galleries, bringing the total number to circa only 30 works. That is about 10% of the paintings and 1% of the original collection. The 1992 installation shows a grouping of Safavid paintings with with paintings of Shiite saints and a portrait of Ayatollah Khomeini. Can you see that? Okay. I can. Which part of this is the pointer?
You just have to move it on the...
Oh, you move this?
As a mouse. I'll show you. And a mouse.
Oh, there I go.
There you go.
Okay. Anyway, this you can recognize as the Safavid painting. These are religious paintings, and this is a portrait of Ayatollah Khomeini. So, this was the way they were displayed in 1992. In my opinion, a purely ideological installation, not compliant with international museum practices or historical veracity. In the later installation, there's another one. Perhaps more in tune with international museological standards, the paintings are displayed chronologically and thematically. As I have shown, in their original context, the Negarestan installation, the paintings visualize the complete story of an era and a culture. Furthermore, they were not treated in isolation as here, but shown with the other arts of the period. By 1992, the paintings' meanings have been distorted and diluted by being grouped in an ahistorical manner, following a new ideology only partially remedied by the more recent presentations. Since 2014, revived interest in the Amory collection only has resulted in a number of publications and translations in Farsi. No reference is ever made to the Negarestan or its collections. As far as this is known, this was also the case as recently as July 26, 2018, when a conference on the Amory collection was held at the Shahbanou Museum. This is the Iranian half of the story. Unfortunately, while Qajar art has been extensively studied and presented abroad since 1979, the disappearance of the museum's collection led to its exclusion from exhibitions and publications and produced huge lacunae in the field of Qajar studies. The 2018 Louvre exhibition, L'Empire des Roses, borrowed extensively from Iran, but not the Negarestan paintings, thus depriving a younger generation of seeing for themselves the immense contribution of Qajar art to world culture. In conclusion, the Negarestan Museum's location near the Marble Palace in the heart of downtown Tehran spelled its doom under the new government. The confiscation of the collection has resulted in its erasure in the broadest terms from Iranian historical memory and in narrower terms from Iranian and global museum studies. Let us return to the motivation of the Islamic regime for such an act. Of course, they were uncomfortable with the origin story of the collection, so closely associated with the previous monarchy. They were also faced with the dilemma of whether to acknowledge or erase the act of repatriation, and clearly chose the latter. The regime also considered museums and cultural property more as instrument of state policy, including tourism, rather than guardians of a shared heritage of the Iranian people. This legacy can, however, inspire a new generation, and I'm talking to you, to take up the cause of what I would call cultural activism, which sees museums and their collections as dynamic, apolitical entities. We can build on the heritage activism in Iran, which has centered thus far on issues such as the use of green spaces and the threat to the Shahbanou Museum complex by urban development, and recovering the Tehran Qanot system. Let us now speak truth to power and direct this same activism to the fate of museum collections such as the Negarestan, and hold the government accountable for its disappearance. On so many levels, we are all the poorer because of it. On the most basic level, I ask each of you who in the future may wish to publish some of these works to give them their proper provenance. And I welcome you to contact me on academia.edu or on Facebook for any further information. But let us propose a more creative resolution, only possible in the most perfect of worlds. Recent research and the discovery of the original plan for the Pahlavi family residences clearly showed that the two buildings were intended to be seen together, a parallel to the Parquet Farah, today's Parquet Lale, which housed the Carpet Museum in Tomoka. On the screen, you see a 1974 map of Tehran, very difficult to acquire, so it's before many of the museums were built, thanks to Talin Grigor. But it does show the Parquet Farah. Here's a detail. You can see the Parquet Farah in the upper left. And we've drawn a yellow line down to where the Negarestan was originally located. Now, with the reopening of the Marble Palace in February 2020, which is a remarkable act, it would be fitting for the Negarestan Museum, with its full complement of collections, to be reopened as well. After the dispersal and distortion of previous decades, this act could now give back the respect the works deserve and fulfill the museum's original mission. By restoring this cultural axis to a reimagined city, Tehran could truly become the city of museums it aspires to be. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.